In this video, we will show you how to replace your rear wheel bearing and hub assembly on this Acura MDX. This will be located behind your rear wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing we have to do is safely raise and support the rear of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. Once you've completed that, we're going to remove the wheel by removing all 5 of our 22mm lug nuts, and then we can get this off of here. With the wheel out of the way, let's pay close attention to the caliper. We have to push back the caliper piston, which would essentially be in this area here. To be able to do that easily, we'll use a small pry bar. We'll take that right inside this area, pressing up against the brake pad on the inboard side there. You can start pulling this outward. Once you have movement from there, we'll continue on to our 2 caliper slider mounting bolts. To remove your 2 caliper slider mounting bolts, we'll be using a 12mm for these. We'll fully remove the first one, quick inspection, start it back in a couple threads. Once you have the caliper off of there, the next thing we need to do is pay attention along where the piston is. You can see a dust seal. If you see any fluid coming out of the dust seal, that means that the internal seal is bad on the caliper and you'd want to go ahead and replace it. This one looks fine. Our caliper piston's all the way pushed in, so let's hang this aside, putting no pressure on the flex hose. Now let's remove our brake pads. We'll give them a quick inspection, make sure it doesn't look like they're worn at an angle. If they are, there could be an issue with the caliper that you'd want to take care of. Same for this. Now we can remove the caliper bracket. This is held in place with 2 14mm headed mounting bolts. You know what to do. We'll remove the first bolt, start it back in just a couple threads, fully remove the second. We'll give this a quick inspection, set it aside for now. It's time to start removing the brake rotor. Along the outer portion of the rotor, you're going to find that there's 2 Phillips head screws holding this in place to the wheel hub located behind it. To remove these, we're going to use a Phillips head impact driver. I'll put this right onto one of my Phillips head screws. I'm going to lightly turn this counterclockwise and we'll give this a couple taps to break it free. A quick inspection, we will be reusing these. Now let's remove this rubber plug from the adjustment port. For this, I'm just using a small screwdriver. We'll just work it out of here. We will be reusing this as well. Now we can start removing the rotor. Take hold of it and pull it away from the wheel hub. If it's stuck in place, lightly tap with a hammer around any of these flat areas, but definitely not on your braking surface. With the brake rotor off of there, the next thing you have to do is inspect your emergency brake shoes. You'll have a rearward one and a forward one. We want to make sure they're not worn to the point that they have to be replaced, and they're definitely not damaged and falling apart in any way. With the brake rotor out of the way, let's remove the 36mm axle nut. Quick inspection of that. We'll use a hammer and punch directly in the center of the axle to break it free from the wheel bearing hub. Once you do see movement here, we're going to make our way along the backside to remove our mounting hardware holding this in place. Let's make our way along the backside of the knuckle. We're looking for where the wheel bearing attaches to the knuckle. You're going to find that there's 4 17mm headed mounting bolts holding it in place. There's 2 along the backside here and 2 along the front, pretty much in the same area. To be able to easily remove these, we'll be using a 17mm swivel socket. A quick note when doing this, be extremely careful not to cause any damage to your axle boot. There's one of our bolts right there. Now we'll move to the next one just above it. Let's move along, repeating the process for the 2 forward mounting bolts. Continuing from here, we'll start removing the bearing from this area. You may find that it's stuck in place. If it's stuck in place, carefully try prying it away, being extremely careful not to cause any damage to your emergency brake shoes or even the hardware. You could try tapping on it with a hammer. You just want to be careful not to hit up against the shoes themselves. I'm just going to use a long prying device. I'll make my way up along this area where I can see my upper mounting point, and we'll gently start prying this away. Come along the bottom here. Once again, I'm being extremely careful not to cause any damage, but I can feel some movement. Now we're going to start pulling this off of the axle located behind it. And there it is, friend. With the wheel bearing out of place, the next thing you need to do is clean and inspect the mounting point. We want to clean this whole inboard area here, along the outer aspect of the axle, and the splined area of the axle. After cleaning it, a thorough inspection, and then we'll apply some copper anti-seize. Use a glove finger to spread it around as needed. We're also going to use some of that anti-seize and come right along this port. There we are. Be careful for that ABS sensor. Now it's time to install our brand new wheel bearing. Let's just pay close attention to the backside here. You have this magnetic ring. You want to be extremely careful not to cause any damage, and also make sure there's no miscellaneous debris on there. Let's get this in position by sliding it over the axle and press it in up against the backing. Now, once you feel as though you have it pressed in, the next thing we need to do is pay attention to those mounting bolt holes. There's 4 of them, and they need to be properly aligned. You may have to spin the base a little bit. Once they are aligned, we'll continue on along the backside for our 4 mounting bolts. It's good habit to use blue thread locker on these. There's the 2 forward bolts. Let's move along to the 2 rearward mounting bolts as well. Let's get these bolts in here. Once you have all the mounting bolts started in, go ahead and snug them up. After you have them bottomed out, we're going to torque them to 72 foot-pounds. There's one. Continuing on, it's time for the axle nut. For this, you only want to use hand tools installing it, never an impact tool, because you don't want to cause damage to your wheel bearing. We'll start this on, snug it up. Torque that to 181 foot-pounds. Now when you go to tighten this, if you find that it wants to spin on you, you want to try holding that still, preventing it from spinning. To do this, with the vehicle down close to the ground, we can use a pry bar diagonally, making its way across the lug studs, being extremely careful not to cause any damage, all the way down to the ground. That'll prevent it from spinning, and we can torque this to 181 foot-pounds. You can see how this works. Lodges right in there. Continuing from here, the next thing that you need to pay attention to is the slot that's on the very tip of the axle here. It's important to make sure you use a hammer and a punch and drive this portion of the nut down inside that slot, which will prevent it from loosening up on you while you're driving down the road. Now let's continue on with some copper anti-seize along the mating surface of the wheel hub where the brake rotor will sit. Before we install the rotor, we'll have a look just down in this area. You can see the adjustment cog. You have the small port in the rotor. You're going to have to make your way through there once it is properly installed, and this is how you would adjust your emergency brake shoes. You can adjust it one direction or the other to either expand the shoes outward towards the rotor or inward away from the rotor. When we go to put the rotor on here, we want to make sure that the rotor aligns with the mounting bolt holes as well as the studs. Now it's time for our 2 mounting screws. We'll start them in by hand. Once it feels as though it's bottomed out, just give it a little tap with your hammer. Continuing from here, before we start reinstalling the rest of the brakes, we're going to make our adjustment for the emergency brake shoes. For this, I'm just going to use a flat blade screwdriver. I'm going to align the port with that small cog that you saw just a second ago. Once you have it properly aligned, we're going to spin this, like I said, in one direction or the other to make our adjustment. What we're feeling for here is a tiny bit of drag. You don't want very much because drag creates friction. Friction's going to create heat, which will cause the shoes to expand and potentially lock up your brakes. You just want to hear a tiny bit here. There we are. After confirming that you're properly adjusted, we'll continue on with our small plug. We're just going to press that right into the brake rotor here, protecting the area. Let's get this caliper bracket in place. Just going to take this, we'll slide it right up against the rear knuckle here, aligning the mounting bolt ports. We can start in both of those mounting bolts. We'll use some blue thread locker on each of these bolts. We'll snug these up and then torque them to 65 foot-pounds. Now it's time to install our brake pads. The inboard pad will have a wear indicator, and we want the wear indicator in the upright position. There we are. Before we get the caliper in place, let's continue on with our high temperature lubricant. We're going to lubricate the piston and along the backside of each of these 2 ears, essentially in all the areas that will touch up against the brake pads. This will help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Slide this right on here. Now we'll continue on with our 2 caliper slider mounting bolts. Start them in, snug them up. The torque for these is 27 foot-pounds. One last quick inspection in this area and we can reinstall our wheel. Start on all 5 of your 22mm lug nuts. We'll bottom them out. Get the wheel safely back down on the ground and torque each of these to 94 foot-pounds. We've got the wheel back on the ground. We'll torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Okay, friend, we finished the installation of our rear wheel bearing. The next thing you need to do is go ahead and pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm. Take your vehicle for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.